Hi, and welcome to this NPTEL course titled The Novel and Change. We'll start with a new novel today, which happens to be Jhumpa Lahiri's novel, The Lowland. We've just finished reading Sitsi Dangarembga's novel, The Nervous Conditions, and we looked at how the gender mappings in a novel in terms of how the female subject embodies her agency, articulates her agency to different forms of appropriation and authority are represented in the novel. And we saw how something like hysteria can also be seen as a site of resistance rather than looking at it uncritically and unproblematically as a site of absence. So we just finished that, and I think it's a good point to move on to the final set of texts in this course, which happens to be, constituted of Jhumpa Lahiri's novel as well. So on your screen, there's an essay with the title "The Diffuse Gender Codes and Transcultural Outcomes" in Jhumpa Lahiri's The Lowland, and it's written by Adriana Elena Stoican. Is part of a book, really, with the title Gender in Focus, Identities, Codes, Stereotypes, and Politics. So that's the title of the book in which this particular essay is included. And the reason why I chose this essay when looking at Lahiri's fiction, or this novel in particular, is it really gives an interesting idea in terms of how the female agency and identity in a politically complex landscape such as the lowland, which obviously talks about a very volatile political situation. There's a reference to Naxalbari movement in the 1960s, West Bengal, and how the female agency emerges as an act of negotiation, as an act of different forms of performativity in such a political subtext. Now, the other reason why I think this essay is important because it also gives us a really interesting vocabulary from critical studies and cultural studies, which I think is very useful for a course like this. Because if you remember, we talked about at the beginning of the course, we talked about how we will spend a little bit of time talking about how literary theory and critical theory may be used, literary criticism may be used in an understanding, a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between text and context, or the traffic between text and context, especially in a course with the title The Novel and Change. So I think this essay is a good step in that direction because it talks about the novel in question, Lahiri's The Lowland, and it also gives us a really interesting engagement with concepts such as transculturation and identity formation in complex contact zones. So I think the vocabulary and the interpretative lens which is espoused in the essay are useful for us as well. And it's part of the content we have as well in terms of looking how literary theory may be engaged with in this particular course. Now, moving on, let's look at what the essay sets out to do in terms of its proposed premise. So, as I mentioned, the focus over here is the gendered quality and the diffuse gender code. So, the word diffused is important because it talks about the very fluid diffusion of gender codes in a novel like The Lowland, and how that corresponds, conforms, as well as subverts some of the mainstream political momentum, some of the mainstream narratives of politics in a very transcultural situation. So, the introduction sets out what it aims to do. So, relying on a cultural studies approach to literature and of migration, this chapter focuses on Jhumpa Lahiri's first generation female protagonist, Gauri, from a novel The Lowland. The plot is initially placed in Kolkata around the late 1940s when two brothers, Subhash and Udayan, are born. In the late 1960s, their lives take different turns as Subhash applies for a PhD in the United States, while Udayan becomes attracted by the Naxalbari movement. Now, this trope of using two brothers who move to two very different directions apropos of a political situation is a very ancient trope in literature, really. There are many examples you can think of in fiction and short stories and poetry and theater as well, where the sibling relationship is used to highlight the contrasted receptions to different political movements at different points of time. But it's worth mentioning there's another Bengali novel, and I think there's an English translation as well, by Sunil Gandhopadhyay called East West, which is also about this, which is also about the idea of different movements, ideological movements, apropos of Naxalbari, right? So if you read East West, there are two brothers. One of them ends up in America, and the other one dies early. but there's this ideological alignment and alienation which take place apropos of a political revolution. So it's a good idea to read East West in dialogue with what Lahiri does or offers in the lowland. So this leftist political manifestation was ignited by the West Bengal peasant uprising against the landlords' feudal ownership and taxation policy. That's the historical backdrop of the Naxalbari movement, where it was a farmers' movement against the exploitative mechanisms of taxation and ownership, which then obviously snowballed into a more general movement across the state, and then it ended up becoming a very metropolitan movement as well. Brutally repressed by the police, the insurgency triggered a chain of violent confrontations between the guerrilla revolutionaries and the Indian state. So it became a proper, very violent battle, a very violent political movement directed against the machineries of the nation state. Udayan illustrates the profile of the young Bengali intellectuals drawn by the revolution's ideological romanticism. Now, it's a very, very problematic word, ideological romanticism, especially when it comes to a very complex and a very violent political movement such as the Naxalbari movement. So you can see how there is a degree of ideological reification just happening as well at the level of romanticism, because, on one hand, there is a romanticization of it, but on the other hand, there is also a reification of it. This interplay of reification and romanticization is important for us to notice at this point. So he's eventually executed by the police, while his parents and wife witness the whole scene. So it's a very violent scene as well. And the whole revolution, the whole political movement was very, very violent, as some of you know. While in America, Subhash maintains connection with his brother, especially via letters. And Subhash is the other son, the other male figure who migrates to America, becomes a respectable American with this proper cultural coding. And of course, he comes to know of his brother's untimely accidental death and tragic death, really violent death. And then, of course, he's redrawn to his family. Thus, he is informed about Udayan's marriage to a girl named Gauri, despite the parents' disapproval. After his brother's death, Subhash temporarily returns to India, where he is moved by Gauri's seclusion in his parents' house. Finding out that she carries Udayan's child, Subhash proposes to Gauri, meaning to offer her a new life in America. Away from India, Gauri gives birth to a girl, Bela, but her marriage with Subhash does not work. So you can see how Gauri obviously becomes the really interesting character in the novel in terms of movement and migration from ideological position in a very volatile state of West Bengal to the shift to migration to America and subsequent choice of career, profession, and academia, which he prioritizes over motherhood. So there is a lot of really interesting readings one can do in terms of looking at the characterization of Gauri and how her rebellion, her inaction of agency is very, very non-male. It doesn't require the validation of the male spaces, whether the monumental structures of a political rebellion or the more discursive designs through which rebellion and subversion may be defined. Rather, her subversion, her rebellion is more intimate, more liminal in quality. And in that sense, it is really dialogic with the text we just finished reading, which is Sirsi Dangarembga's novel Nervous Conditions, right? So there is a reason why we sequenced out these texts accordingly. So the discussion traces the character's evolution as she crosses temporal, physical, and cultural borders. So this border crossing becomes a really important trope in this novel and is also part of the characterization technique that Lahiri espouses. Considering a body of theories regarding transcultural processes and nomadic identities, the discussion sets out to interpret Gauri's radical choice of transformation along disruptive lines. By analyzing her obstinate cling to individualistic norms of identity, the chapter attempts to formulate hypotheses regarding possible connections between transcultural changes, nomadic travel, trans difference, and female disempowerment. So you can see the word trans come across really as a metaphor of fluidity, polyphony, as well as some kind of a subversive design which cuts across the notional binaries and notional boundaries between oppositional states. So Gauri's character is really interesting because she moves from a position of absolute affiliation to a position of transformation, a position of subversion, really, to very radical disruptive lines, and a refusal to conform to the choices that are profiled around her is obviously becoming is obviously an act of agency articulation, which undercuts any male momentum, any male idea of revolution, and a male idea of a revolutionary as well. So the present analysis takes into account the cultural studies premise that culture is expressed by means of symbolic forms linked with a specific social context, deeply embedded in the texture. So the symbolism of culture, the social context of culture, the semiotic context of culture obviously they intertwine with each other. This chapter considers the literary text as a witness and a repository of cultural experiences in the context of South Asian women's relocation, assuming that there is a link between processes of cultural displacement and Lahiri's background of transplantation. So Lahiri's own personal experiences and exposure as a second-generation diaspora child obviously informs her narrative design. So some of you may have read her collection of short stories called The Interpreter of Maladies, and also her very famous novel subsequent to that, which is The Namesake. So again, we can see how Lahiri is obviously plugging into or drawing on many experiences that she's familiar with personally and experientially as a second-generation Bengali diasporic child growing up in Boston. Without arguing that the lowland is representative of the cultural evolution of South Asian female migrants, I consider that it offers insightful visions regarding the contemporary rhythms of cultural change. More precisely, the analysis sets out to identify peculiar intersections of gender norms that generate reconfigurations of female subjectivity in the context of migration. So how migration, both as a physical movement across borders, as well as a psychological negotiation between structures, between borders, between designs becomes important. And of course, what it produces is a very effective liminal understanding of identity as an activity of negotiation, as a function of negotiation. So my interpretation of Gauri attempts to retrieve a personal account of female cultural redefinition, relying on the potential of a creative literature to fill in the gaps inherent in the sociological conclusions about migration. So this is where the literariness of the novel becomes really important, and it sort of speaks to the fundamental philosophy of a course like this, Novel and Change. So how does the literary landscape of the novel uniquely able to articulate the inarticulatable or say the unsayable, right? So that becomes obviously part of the potential of a novel, potential literary form of representation, to fill in the gaps, to engage with silences, to engage with elisions. And that sometimes can really supplement any sociological, anthropological, ethnographic understanding of migration in very unique ways. So this kind of investigation is meant to offer more biographical approaches with an emphasis placed on individuals and their understanding of the realities of the situation. Following these considerations, the next section presents a series of theoretical notions that will be applied in a discussion of the primary corpus. This body of theories connects processes of migration with cultural dimensions of gender and the transgressive potential of transcultural change. So how transcultural change can also produce transgression, sometimes accidentally and sometimes deliberately, right? So, and of course, gender being a very important component, a very important vertical over here, that obviously makes it even more complex in quality. So you can begin to see how this novel is uniquely dialoguing, although it's a different geopolitical context entirely, with a novel like Nervous Conditions by Tsitsi Dangarembga. Now, let's spend a little bit of time talking about what is meant by transculturality. What is a transcultural identity? And this is why I think this essay is useful uniquely, because it also gives us a vocabulary from literary theory, critical theory, which may be applied, which may be mapped very suitably and very deeply, shall we say, to a course like this, which is about novel and change. So transculturality has long been considered a key theoretical notion for the study of migrant writing, since it is related to contemporary phenomena of migration and globalization. The transcultural approach, the transcultural approach offers an adequate understanding of the individual need to negotiate a plurality of cultural models in a context of changing boundaries and rapid developments in technology, transportation, and communication. Now, this is a point that I'd like to highlight, and I think I've mentioned this in other ways earlier as well. When we look at a relationship between the novel and change, or the text and the context, it is absolutely imperative that we take the vocabulary and or the presence of the materiality in question. So what kind of a materiality surrounds the subject at any given point of time? So a diachronic study of technology, for example, a diachronic study of the evolution of the materials of memory, the materials of technology, the materials of communication and transportation, etc., are absolutely vital for any sophisticated study of cultural identity, because we can't have an identity without the materiality around it. So the identity, the social identity, the biological identity is always already embedded through different forms of materiality. So when you look at something like transculturality, it is important for us to highlight to what extent is a subject negotiating with the material matrix around them. So transculturality involves the transgression of spatial and temporal boundaries and a questioning of the clear binaries connoted by them. So in that sense, transculturality becomes innately transgressive and deconstructive in quality, because it does away with notional boundaries of state, of of spatiality, of temporality, and so on and so forth. Right. Now, we have a few really interesting passages which give us some really insightful glance into what can be considered as transculturality. And I've deliberately chosen these because I think they sort of speak to some of the things that we are engaging with as well in a study of novel and change. So what are the implications of the transcultural paradigm? Is that cultures are incomplete sets of practices that need to interact and enrich themselves through cultural exchanges. And as a quote, a transcultural model begins from the assumption that an individual or a cultural identity is never complete in itself because of its relations in a field of differences. And that's a really interesting way to look at identity in a transcultural setting, where identity becomes less a function of association and more a function of differentiation. To what extent is identity emergent apropos of a field of differences? To what extent is identity a function, a performance, and a transaction or a navigation or a negotiation across a field of differences? So the relationality of identity, the relativity of identity apropos of a field of differences is absolutely crucial. So across differences, across different forms of differences, how is an identity performative at any given point of time? So this also talks about the temporality, the mutability, the plasticity of identities in a transcultural setting. As individuals realize that their familiar cultural space do not cover the whole set of human aspirations, they are more inclined to accept the validity of their other cultural works or worlds. In this way, the need to transcend the boundaries of their own cultures shapes a transcultural perspective that frees them from a limited range of options. So it gives them a broader buffet, really, in terms of the options available to aspire for and appropriate at any given cultural moment. So transculture builds new identities in a zone of fuzziness, very important word, zone of fuzziness. So the fuzzy feeling, the nebulous quality, the playful quality, the translucent quality through which transculturality operates. Zone of fuzziness and interference and challenges the metaphysics of discreteness, so characteristic of nations, races, professions, and other established cultural configuration. So the discrete boundaries, the discrete dualisms which are used to classify nations, classify races, classify professions, and different forms of identity iterations are dissolved and deconstructed in a very, very charged transcultural setting. Therefore, the idea of cultures as self-transcendent entities is an important principle of transculturality that accounts for the necessity to acknowledge the relevance of other cultural worlds. So there is that sense of engagement with alterity, engagement with otherness, that transculturality necessitates. So that necessitization of an engagement with otherness becomes an absolute imperative when it comes to transcultural identities. So at this point, the notion of transdifference advanced by Ganser may be correlated with transcultural processes of identity transformation, since both approaches challenge binary categorizations. By defining transdifference as a collision of differences, Ganser argues that it expresses inherent irregularity of identity negotiation processes. So the word irregularity and the word collision become very important over here. So you can see how there is a degree of violence in the production of identities through difference. So the violence can be casual, the violence can be slow, the violence can be overt, the violence can be covert, the violence can be invisible, but it also becomes a function of violence apropos of differences. So the word collision here is not accidental. It serves a purpose, it serves a function to imply the violent vocabulary which sometimes are associated with the production of identity. So therein lies the inherent irregularity of identity negotiation processes. So the idea of negotiation, the idea of negotiable identity, transactional identity, are all processes of different identity formations, right? So we can see how the word irregularity also implies, or also connects to the metonymic function of identity in terms of the incompletion of identity, the identity as an act of incomplete approximation, right? How it's never really an absolute appropriation, but an incomplete appropriation. And one can dial back to some of the very, very traditional tenets or templates in post-colonial theory, really something like hybridity or mimicry, and we will see how the idea of incomplete approximation becomes a very powerful function of identity iteration. So considering that it captures overlapping layers of multiple differences, transdifference points to cultural and textual phenomena that are incomprehensible via binary models of difference. So the entire binary model, or the industry of binary dualistic ways of looking at identity, is done away with. However, Ganser warns against the conflation of transdifference with synthesis or hybridization, transculturation, stressing that the former does not entail dissolution of differences into cultural fusions. Instead, transdifference refers to the coeval interplay of differences that may result in dissonance rather than harmony, right? So rather than looking at identity as a function of harmony, a function of synthesis, a function of integration, what we see is in a transcultural setting, identity can be seen as a function of dissonance, a function of disintegration, a function of violent production, accidental production, serendipitous production, right? Now, I consider that a parallel can be drawn between transculturality and transdifference, in the sense that both involve a transgressive dimension, right? So the idea of breaking the boundaries, the idea of crossing the boundaries, sometimes visibly, sometimes invisibly, sometimes covertly, sometimes casually. So all these become very important components in a transgressive dimension of identity in a transcultural setting. More specifically, a transcultural outlook involves a transgressive step that carries individuals into the realm of difference, right? So difference becomes a field of difference, becomes really interesting over here, how identities become a field of difference or a function within the field of difference. And when I say the word field, obviously in a very scientific vocabulary, a field also implies mutability, a field also implies plasticity, a field also implies kinesis in very complex ways. So, therefore, in the case of migrant identities, the transcultural urge to cross physical boundaries marks the passage into unfamiliar cultural worlds, providing full access to multiple differences. So, multiplicity, polyphony, heteroglossy, it all become very important concepts to study transcultural identities. So, relying on the intersections between transculturality and transdifference, the present analysis in this particular essay sets out to establish whether Gori's cultural metamorphosis results in a transcultural synthesis or a dissonant accumulation of different norms. So, whether it's a synthesis or is it a function of dissonance? That's something which this essay sets out to explore. At the same time, the argument will also interpret the nature of a change in relation to the mobility as a coordinate that may disempower women migrants. So you notice that the word disempower is put, the word dis, the bit dis is put within brackets, which means that that which empowers can also disempower in a different point, a different experiential point, a different discursive point, right? So the what lies at the heart of this argument is that the relationship between the boundaries between empowerment and disempowerment may be quite fuzzy. The word fuzzy has appeared already. Maybe quite nebulous, maybe quite mutable, maybe redrawn or restretched depending on the experiential, discursive dimension at any given point of time. Now, what are the transgressive urges? What are the transgressive affect economy which inform transcultural changes? The inherent transcendence of transcultural processes may be interestingly coupled with transgressive mechanisms as strategies of contesting established cultural norms in the context of migrant relocation. The very idea of transgression carries geographical connotations, given its literal meaning of crossing a boundary. So that's what transgression means, crossing a boundary. At the same time, resettlement entails a shift to an outer place status that contains potential for resistance. So, outer place obviously is something which implies alterity. At the same time, something which implies strangeness, the uncanny, the out of the home, the unhomely. The notion of transgression serves as a useful tool for examining Gori's strategy of contesting conventional identity roles, the idea of the performative identity, the appropriatable identity, which play a very important role in the characterization of Gori. The character's rebellious stance demonstrates the importance of transgression as a mechanism of revealing the historical and mutable nature of that which is usually considered the way things are, right? The way things are obviously is the monolithic understanding of identity, the monolithic seamless continuity processes with which the self is established and reestablished, but that is fractured and interrupted in this particular novel. At this point, the notion of transiency of identity or the temporality of identity, the mutability of identity becomes important, serves as a rich conceptual instrument that provides further clarification to the epistemological end of transgression. Coming from the Latin transire, to go across, to pass, the term couples the idea of spatial and temporal change. So it's a spatio-temporal compound. It's a capsule of space and time, and how the change happens, sometimes slow, sometimes accidental, sometimes abrupt, across different dimensions of space and time. In relation to the dynamics of identity, on the one hand, the concept encodes the continuous flow of identity change across a temporal axis, its state of constant becoming that defies the possibility of essentialized perspective. So it is very counter-essentializing in many ways because it's a flow of identities, the fluidity, the performativity of identity becomes very important, especially when it comes to border crossing, literal, metaphorical, liminal, affective border crossings. On the other hand, the notion also makes reference to processes of identity transformation triggered by individuals' mobility across shifting borders and territorialities, right? So the shifting territoriality, the cultural geographies, the topographies across which the self can travel, the subject can travel, assuming, reassuming, picking up different forms of identity markers also becomes important. Thus, the double connotation of this term may allow for a fruitful interpretation of the labyrinthine nature of Gori's physical transgression that pushes her beyond normative expectations. So the entire economy of expectations is fractured in this novel because Gauri obviously becomes a slow, subversive figure who refuses to conform to the role of the revolutionary's wife or the mourner or the widow or the mother, and she chooses something very different. The preparation of the Academy of America. That becomes a choice, that becomes an act of agency, which obviously is supremely subversive in quality. The following section presents theories regarding the possibility of women's empowerment as conditioned by their access to a regime of mobility, right? So a certain regime of mobility in terms of a certain economy of mobility, which is at play over here, and how women's agency via access, via articulation may be seen as an act of negotiation with that regime of mobility. So we'll stop at this point now and we'll continue the discussion in the subsequent sessions. Thank you for your attention.